Many years ago, I read this small little blurb in a medical journal, The Lancet, about a group of researchers who go around looking for the healthiest people in the world. And specifically, in this case, the people with the healthiest hearts in the world. And for a long time, that distinction belonged to Japanese women, mostly living in the island of Okinawa. But now the Lancet researchers, they were describing this group of people who lived in Bolivia, in the middle of the Amazon rainforest, an indigenous tribe. And they said, these are the people with the healthiest hearts in the world. And I, as an investigative medical reporter who travels all over the world, who also has a significant family history of heart disease, decided I wanted to go visit. I wanted to go to Bolivia and learn about the healthiest hearted people in the world, see what kind of lessons I could learn and what I could bring back to the States here. So I don't know if any of you have ever been to Bolivia, but I flew into La Paz, Bolivia, which is the capital city, highest altitude capital city, by the way, in the world. They actually give you oxygen as you're starting to land, which I'd never seen before. Once we landed, we got in the small little planes and flew to Ruranbaque, which is a small little town on the edge of the Amazon rainforest, got into these 4x4 vehicles, drove into the forest as far as we could, then got into these canoes and just started traveling down these little tributaries of the Amazon in search of the Chimane tribe. I really wanted to find this group of people and understand how they live their lives. Now, the first thing you might think is, well, they're an indigenous tribe, of course they're going to be healthy. It's not necessarily the case. Every demographic in the world now is affected by many of the same chronic diseases we deal with here in the United States. Every demographic, no matter how remote they are. But this particular tribe seemed to be different. Another thing about them is they don't speak a language that's remotely similar to anything that I'd ever heard. It was a totally their own native language. So in order to communicate, we had to take multiple translators, English to Spanish, Spanish to Chimane, back and forth. That's how we were going to communicate. By the way, incidentally, I learned that there's about 7,000 languages in the world. But 94% of the population of planet Earth speaks about 6% of those languages. And we're losing another language about every 2 weeks. So every year, we're losing another 100 languages, roughly. That's where we're headed. But ultimately, we got to this particular place on the banks of the Amazon where we found the Chimane, and they were very welcoming. And sort of through this multiple translation, told them what we wanted to do, what I was trying to learn. And I basically just set up my tent in the middle of the Amazon rainforest and just observed for a couple weeks. That's all I wanted to do was observe and see what I could learn about the healthiest hearted people in the world. And I decided to break it down into sort of the big three: activity, diet, and rest. How do they move? How do they nourish themselves? And how do they rest? And the first thing I noticed was their movement was really interesting. I think maybe you have some preconceived notion of what it's like to be a hunter-gatherer in the middle of the Amazon rainforest. What I found was actually quite surprising. People who are hunter-gatherers, they don't hardly ever run. They walk a lot. When they're hunting, they track their prey. They're not going to outrun their prey. And they just track and track and track until the animal gets tired, and that's when they go in for the kill. About 17,000 steps a day on average. It's a lot, but it's doable. The healthiest hearted people in the world walk, not run, about 17,000 steps a day. There's no chairs, as you might imagine, in the middle of the rainforest, and you hardly ever saw people sitting. They were either lying and sleeping, or they were standing and walking. And it's interesting because you may hear a lot that, you may have heard this, sitting is the new smoking. Have you heard this? That's probably a bit of an exaggeration. But when I came back from that trip, I decided to talk to researchers about just how harmful is sitting really. And what was interesting is the way that they described it to me. They said that, most of our human existence, we didn't really sit a lot. And the only people who sat were people who were near the end of their lives. And if you start to look at what happens in their bodies when you sit a lot, is that your body's constantly got this natural defense system. It's fighting off little pathogens in the air, fighting off mutated cells. But when you sit a lot, it's almost like sending a signal to your body. You can lower the perimeter defenses. So you suddenly become more susceptible to things, which I thought was really interesting. Sitting, maybe not the new smoking. And by the way, I hate to tell you this as you're all sitting and I'm standing, but make sure to get up and walk around a little bit later. But the healthiest hearted people in the world, 17,000 steps, and they did not sit very much. When it came to their nourishment, again, you may have this idea of the paleo diet and think maybe that's the sort of diet they eat. They do hunt, but the reality is that there's a lot of bad hunting days. So the vast majority of what the healthiest hearted people eat is farmed food. It's carbs. It's plantains, food like that. You can count on farmed food. That's like money in the bank if you're in the middle of the rainforest. So the healthiest hearted people in the world eat about 70% carbs and walk about 17,000 steps. As far as rest goes, it's really interesting. I had my little tent set up in the middle of this place, and sun goes down about 9:30 at night. You start to hear loud breathing and then eventually snoring in all the tents and places around me. Turns out if you don't have a device to look at, you kind of go to bed pretty early. About 6:30 in the morning, you hear the call and answer of the rooster, and people started to wake up. So we're getting about 9 hours of sleep roughly a night. 17,000 steps, no sitting, 70% carbs, not processed carbs, just carbs, and about 9 hours of sleep. They have virtually no heart disease. It is remarkable. Now, there may be more to the story than that. One of the things I did learn, which I thought was interesting, was that the vast majority of people who live in an environment like that, in the middle of a rainforest, they also deal with pathogens, specifically parasites. Almost all of them get some sort of parasitic infection early in life, hookworm, roundworm, giardia, something like that, and they basically live with that parasite in their bodies their entire life. There's no anti-parasitic drugs. They get sick when they first get infected, and then it's just there. And what is so interesting about that is that most of the diseases we talk about, heart disease, diabetes, dementia, they all have some component of our own immune system actually either igniting or worsening those diseases. Our immune systems, which we live in these incredible bubbles of cleanliness, oftentimes start to get bored, according to these researchers, and increasingly inwardly focus their attention on their own bodies. If you have a parasite in your body, you may be giving your immune system something to do and decreasing the likelihood of developing those autoimmune diseases. I don't think any of you are going to go out and intentionally get a parasitic infection, but just think about that. We spend $1 billion a day on heart disease in the United States. They don't spend a penny. They don't even have a healthcare system. And they are the healthiest hearted people in the world. It's worth paying attention to, engaging in the basics, trying to understand the value of those basics, things that have withstood the test of time. Instead, oftentimes, we spend money on things that don't work, that have not withstood the test of time. About 500,000 people a year around the world undergo stenting, cardiac stenting for angioplasty, for something known as stable angina, which means stable chest pain. They're not in the throes of a heart attack, but they have stable chest pain. And several years ago, they wanted to figure out how well does this really work. So they did this study, which I think would be a hard study to get approved nowadays, but basically they divided these patients into two groups. Half got stents, and half got an angiogram where they put a catheter into your blood vessel, but they did not actually put a stent in. It's called the Sham procedure. And as you can probably guess, given that I'm telling you the story, there was not a statistical difference between the two groups based on things like exercise tolerance, overall lifestyle, likelihood of a future heart attack, and survival. There was no statistical difference for one of the most commonly performed cardiac procedures in the world. Not only do we not engage in some of the basics, which we know can make a difference, we have plenty of evidence that it does over time and still in societies around the world, and instead we spend a lot of money on things that have been proven not to make a difference. In some ways, it's totally predictable. As a society evolves, it becomes addicted to the quick fix, to the high tech. But as we know, medicine often plays by different rules, and maybe that's not always a bad thing. Sometimes technology and innovation can come painstakingly slow when it comes to medicine. You take the story of some of our earliest inventions. One of the earliest inventions, the wheel, right? Mankind had the wheel, which now meant we were mobile. We could move. So because we could move, we started to develop rudimentary forms of luggage to move our stuff. So we had the wheel and we had the luggage, and that was really early in human civilization, but it was only recently, relatively, that we started putting wheels on luggage. Things can move slow. It's a good example of how things happen in medicine. What I have learned is that as we innovate, take some of the lessons from the global south, but also innovate on our own, we have to understand that the types of innovations within medicine, types of innovations that maybe any of you would feel comfortable with, are ones that you're going to have to feel, even if they don't work, you still have a very good default position. Mitch Hedberg, one of my favorite comedians, he had this quote that I loved. He said, I really love escalators because escalators can never break. They can only become stairs. And I thought that was such a good metaphor for how I think about medical innovation. Yes, we want to innovate, but the default position should be something that still works and something we are really, really comfortable with. At the end of the day, the innovations that win make us healthier and happier and more connected, and probably in medicine always rely on a human element.